Hello, Hobbits, and welcome back to Lady of the Rings. Today, we are getting into Chapter 3, Three is Company. I'm your host, Sophia, and if you're listening along, thank you so much for checking out my podcast. I'm having a lot of fun doing this, and I'm just really excited to get more of an audience, get more people listening, and hear more feedback from you guys as you are going through the episodes and reading together. So today we start our journey with Frodo, Sam, and Pippin leaving Bag End and beginning our walk through the Shire, which quickly becomes filled with danger. And we also meet a company of high elves that the hobbits end up staying with for a night. So just as a reminder, in Chapter 2, where we left off, Gandalf has just imparted all of his wisdom and what he's learned about the ring to Frodo. They've decided that Frodo needs to leave the Shire. He can't stay there any longer. And it is important for him to leave sooner rather than later. At the beginning of Chapter 3, we learn that 2 to 3 weeks have actually passed since the night or the morning that they talked about the ring in Chapter 2. And Gandalf has just been staying with Frodo at Bag End. And they've been just kind of hanging out, talking about how Frodo's going to leave without too much notice. They agree that he can't just vanish like Bilbo did because it'll cause too much gossip. And we learn in the very beginning as well that Frodo is reluctant to leave. He doesn't want to leave Bag End because all of a sudden it feels more enjoyable to him than it ever has before. And the only thing that's really motivating him to consider actually leaving is following Bilbo. So now that he knows he must leave, like I said, he's savoring the Shire, he's enjoying Bag End, and he's realizing, despite the fact that he has been restless for all these years, especially since Bilbo left, he's really appreciating the beauty of his home and what he's had for all these years, thinking to himself and understanding that he may not return. He likely won't return in his own mind. He doesn't think that he will. Gandalf is encouraging him to, like I said at the very beginning, leave rather quickly. However, Frodo suggests that autumn may be a good time for him to leave. He says on or after our birthday. That's how he refers to his and Bilbo's birthday on September 22nd. He says, I think I could probably make some arrangements by then. He also says, or Frodo thinks to himself in this moment, that he knows that when autumn comes, he will be a little bit more likely to be ready to leave, although I don't think he ever thinks he's going to be ready to leave. It's kind of when you're asked to move on from a place or a point or a person in your life, and it's really difficult to do that when you may not have appreciated all the things that you've gotten used to. And even things like your home and things that you've had your whole life, they're things that can be taken away. They're things that can be moved on from. And Frodo's really appreciating his last summer in the Shire at this point. Gandalf agrees that it is a good idea to leave on or around their birthday. I think that there's a lot of symbolism around Frodo leaving on his own 50th birthday, following Bilbo almost as if going back in time and leaving when Bilbo left on his journey, something that Frodo has always wanted to do his whole life. He understands that there is some significance there, and I think it's important to him to leave at this point and follow Bilbo. He says that following Bilbo was uppermost on his mind and the one thing that made the thought of leaving bearable. So we can really see how much Frodo really cares about Bilbo in this moment and how much following Bilbo and following in his footsteps, not just literally following him outside of the Shire towards Rivendell where Bilbo is staying now, but also symbolically in this 50th year of Frodo's life, following in Bilbo's path the same way that he departed at a similar age. So Gandalf agrees that that will work, and he is clearly a little bit anxious for Frodo. He's worried about the time passing. He also imparts on Frodo that the secrecy around him departing the Shire is of the utmost importance. And at this point, Frodo is thinking as little as possible about the ring. He's really just focused on savoring the Shire and savoring his last couple months at Bag End. Frodo does not know where he's going at this point, only that he must go north, south, east, or west. And I think what's really interesting about the relationship between Gandalf and Frodo that we see a lot more of in these first couple chapters of the books than you do when you watch the movies is that despite Gandalf being this old, wise wizard and Frodo being just a little hobbit, Gandalf leaves much of the decision-making in Frodo's hand. He provides Frodo with all the tools and counsel and guidance that's required to make an informed decision. However, when it comes to exactly what direction Frodo is going in, for example, when he's leaving the Shire, Gandalf actually asks him which direction he thinks he should go and says it is up to him. And that's when Frodo decides that he will set off towards Rivendell, towards the east, and also says, I will take Sam to visit the elves. He will be delighted, which I think is really sweet because he knows how much Sam loves the elves. And it sounds like at this point he's really trying to distract himself from the true nature of why he's going on this journey, why he's going on this mission. He can't really comprehend, or he does comprehend the full danger of what's going on. However, he is not ready to focus on that as he's leaving. It's already hard enough that he's leaving his home that he's known his whole life. So now instead of focusing on this weighty kind of doom-filled quest that he's been tasked with, he's focused on things like following Bilbo, who he cares so deeply about, and showing Sam the elves, which I think is really sweet and shows us more of the nature of Frodo's caring character and how much he cares for the people that are close to him in his life. He's still so unsettled by this uncertainty, and he asks Gandalf, where am I to go? And by what shall I steer? What is to be my quest? Bilbo went to find treasure there and back again, but I go to lose one and not return as far as I can see, which I think is really brave of Frodo to even understand that he may not return. He's not kind of blind to the fact that he may never go back to the Shire. And at that point, he decides to make for Rivendell. And what Gandalf says to him when they decide that he should make for Rivendell, Gandalf replies that that journey should not prove too perilous, and also notes that the journey to the cracks of Mount Doom may be for others, though he does not know yet. So even Gandalf in this moment doesn't necessarily think that Frodo will be the one to bear this ring all the way to Mount Doom, all the way to Mordor, and they're kind of taking it one step at a time. The most important thing at this point in the story is that Frodo leaves because the enemy knows that the ring is in the Shire, that a Baggins has the ring, so that he must go very soon. So this first part of the chapter, really where Gandalf and Frodo decide when Frodo's going to leave, they decide what direction he's going to go in. We really see how Gandalf respects Frodo's decision-making abilities here. We see how much Frodo cares for Bilbo and cares for Sam. And we also see how heartbroken Frodo is to be leaving his home now that he knows he must leave. Once they decide that Frodo will set out for Rivendell, and they decide that Frodo will leave after his and Bilbo's birthday, the same year that Bilbo left on his adventure at that same age, we move to a summer's evening and more of the Hobbit gossip around Frodo Baggins and him actually selling Bag End. So this is also not covered in the movies, right? Frodo kind of just gets the ring and has to leave. He feels like he kind of just leaves immediately. But at this point, you know, like I said, it's been 17 years since Bilbo left. It's been a few weeks since Gandalf has shared all of the knowledge of the ring with Frodo. And now Frodo's spending his last summer in the Shire, and from the lens in this next section of the gossip around Hobbiton, we learn that they are putting the pieces of their plan into place. News that Frodo sold Bag End to the Sackville Bagginses is being talked about at the local pub. And some hobbits are saying that he sold it for a bargain price. Others are saying that he sold it for a lump sum. Some assume that Frodo's running out of money, but all think Frodo is actually going to Buckland to live among the Brandybucks, who are his relatives, and that's where he spent his childhood. So it makes sense that as part of their plan, they would make it seem as though Frodo is moving back to live with his old relatives, especially since Bilbo's already left. I think that him selling Bag End to the Sackville Bagginses also, who had expected it for so long, I think that's also part of their plan. It doesn't really seem suspicious when he's selling it to the relatives who have been nagging him for decades for that property. So basically, we're seeing Gandalf and Frodo's plan and their scheme kind of come together very nicely, in my opinion. I think that at this point, things are going according to plan. Many of the hobbits know that Gandalf has been staying with Frodo for a few weeks, though he's been mostly quiet, kind of staying in the house with Frodo, not trying to cause too much commotion. And they also assume that Gandalf is part in like meddling with Frodo and leaving Bag End, or maybe could be reason for him losing his fortune, or whatever they think is going on. The most important thing is that the hobbits do not assume that anything strange or necessarily out of the ordinary is going on, so that they may share news that Frodo's actually leaving the Shire. He doesn't want anyone to know that he's leaving the Shire. Frodo actually does purchase a small house, it says, at Crick Hollow in the country beyond Bucklebury, and pretended to all that he would live there permanently. And like I said, this is credible because he spent his childhood there. The only person at this point who knows the truth about what Frodo is going to do is Samwise Gamgee, the only hobbit that knows, and obviously Gandalf as well. Tolkien writes, there was no doubt about the fact Frodo Baggins was going back to Buckland. So their plan is going along quite nicely at this point. Merry helped him find a house in the country, this house that he purchased, and also goes on to help him kind of pack up and leave Bag End. We then get a little bit closer, a little bit of a time jump here to Frodo leaving. Gandalf actually stays in the Shire for 2 whole months. And I wonder if Gandalf, for him, it's like a little vacation to stay in the Shire with Frodo and the other hobbits. However, at the end of June, after staying for 2 months, so that means he arrived in April, between March and April. It was springtime, right when he arrived at Bag End, and he told Frodo of the ring, and he hasn't left Frodo. And I wonder if he's reluctant also to leave Frodo's side because he wants to keep an eye on him. He wants to make sure things are going to plan. He knows this is of the utmost importance to make sure that Frodo is able to leave the Shire without too many people knowing of exactly what's going on. So it is the end of June at this point, and Gandalf announces kind of suddenly to Frodo that he has to leave. He says, I have heard something that has made me anxious and needs looking into. I think it necessary, after all, for you to get off at once. I shall come back immediately, or at least send word. In the meanwhile, stick to your plan, but be more careful than ever. He says, at the very latest, I shall come back for the farewell party. I think, after all, you may need my company on the road. At first, Frodo was a good deal disturbed, wondered often what Gandalf could have heard, but his uneasiness wore off, and in the fine weather, he forgot his troubles for a while. So, yeah, clearly Gandalf has heard something that's made him anxious. He has to go look into it. Frodo notices the anxiety, but the fact that Gandalf also says that Frodo might have to leave sooner than his planned departure in September indicates that he knows that there is more of a danger now. And he does say he will send word if he thinks Frodo should leave, and we will learn later that perhaps Frodo should have left sooner, and he didn't because he didn't hear from Gandalf and he doesn't come back. So this summer that Frodo has in the Shire, I think it's just really sad. You know, he's leaving his home. It's the most splendid summer and autumn to him, at least, or from his perspective. it could just be his perception of the Shire now that he knows he's leaving that makes it the most splendid in all his years. And I think that shows us all things kind of become sweeter when we know they're limited, when we know that we're leaving them and we might not come back. As they grow closer to his farewell party, Merry and Pippin and a couple other friends help Frodo pack up his belongings to send them to Buckland and his new home. So autumn arrives after a swift and relaxing summer for Frodo, where he forgets mostly about the ring, his troubles, and maybe worrying about where Gandalf is. Frodo begins to worry about Gandalf once September comes, and it seems like he almost views Gandalf as a ever-present, reliable being who, no matter what, like, he may be worried about the fact that Gandalf hasn't come back, but he at many times thinks that he's going to see him walking up, on the morning of the party. And I think it seems as though every time Frodo begins to worry, it's almost like he trusts his friend. He trusts that Gandalf is capable, that he would have sent word if Frodo needed to leave. And I don't think that Frodo could ever envision a scenario where Gandalf's actually in trouble and unable to tell Frodo to leave or unable to come back and accompany Frodo on the road. Also, the fact that before Gandalf left, he shares with Frodo that he thinks that he needs to accompany him on the road indicates to me that Frodo leaving on his own is actually a much more dangerous, a much more courageous act than maybe he realizes, and we'll see that soon. So the party begins, and despite Frodo's worry, he enjoys his farewell feast with his small group of friends. Tolkien writes, the food was good and there was good wine. Frodo's wine had not been included in the sale to the Sackville Bagginses. So I like how Tolkien puts these little glimpses of humor into the text, and it's usually quite small, like a sentence or so. I think it's pretty funny that he notes this little way that Frodo kind of sticks it to the Sackville Bagginses. Whatever happens to the rest of my stuff, when the SBs get their claws on it at any rate, I have found a good home for this, said Frodo as he drained his glass. It was the last drop of Old Wynyards. I just realized this. SBs, Sackville Bagginses, sons of bitches. I think that might be what that is a nod to. And that's the only time that I've seen it abbreviated like that, the SBs. So maybe instead of Frodo saying Sackville Bagginses, he's actually saying sons of bitches. And I think that's really funny. So they have a good time at Frodo's birthday party. They enjoy each other's company. They drink to Bilbo's health. They drink to Frodo. They go to sleep, and unfortunately, Gandalf still had not come. So the next morning after the party, Frodo and his friends kind of pack up the last of his stuff. Merry says goodbye and goes ahead to the new house to warm it up, he says. Good friend. Pippin remains behind, and Frodo's really anxious. He's listening for Gandalf because he hopes that he'll come. At that point, he decides to wait until nightfall, and it says that his plan for pleasure and a last look at the Shire, as much as any other reason, was to walk from Hobbiton to Bucklebury Ferry, taking it fairly easy. I shall get myself a bit into training too, he said, looking at himself in a dusty mirror in the half-empty hall. He had not done any strenuous walking for a long time, and the reflection looked rather flabby, he thought. So he's looking at himself in the mirror thinking, all right, I could use the exercise. I could use a leisurely walk through the Shire. There's not really a ton of urgency. There's not really a sense of the danger that he's really in. And I think that in reality, in this moment, he should be getting out of there as fast as possible. He probably should have already left, because we learn in a little bit about the Black Riders actually coming to the Shire. They're in the Shire at this point, while Frodo is thinking he's going to go for a nice walk, thinking that he's going to lose some weight, it's not, he's not really in a hurry. While he's waiting for Gandalf, the Sackville Bagginses, the SBs, show up and declare it's theirs at last. Tolkien writes, it was not polite nor strictly true because technically the sale did not go into effect until midnight, despite them showing up right after lunch. And Frodo has to sit there and go over everything that she has paid for, although he does not fault her because she had waited so many years for this. Again, kind of showing Frodo's good nature despite how rude these SBs are. She's not happy with the extra key that is left with the Gamgees and the old gaffer. She clearly thinks they may come steal at night. To that, Frodo does not offer her any tea. So hobbits are so funny like that. They can be a little shady, right? But it's very subtle. It's very kind of silly and sweet. Like, okay, well, you don't get any tea then. Frodo, Sam, and Pippin, they eat their last meal at Bag End. They get ready to leave. Frodo says goodbye to Bag End, and I think this is really sad because basically this was his home with Bilbo for so long. He's already had to say goodbye to so many things very suddenly. Think about earlier in Frodo's life, his parents dying in a tragic accident, losing both of his parents. He gets adopted by Bilbo. He says goodbye to his first home. He goes and lives with Bilbo. Eventually, he has to say goodbye to Bilbo. Bilbo leaves the Shire in his little stunt on his birthday. Frodo's then left with Bag End and without his parent figure who had been with him for most of his life. And then, 17 years later, I'd say he truly loses his innocence when he learns of the true nature of this burden that he has, of the ring that he has been given. And now that he knows the true nature, he's had to say goodbye to all these things throughout his life, he finally has to say goodbye to Bag End, which has been his safe haven, even while being a ring bearer, even while having this horrible, evil thing that he's possessing. Bag End has been the safe haven for him, and it's been a home for him and Bilbo for so long. And I just think that Frodo probably has all these memories of being there, and maybe it doesn't feel the same way it used to feel when he was young, or when he was there with Bilbo, or even when he was there with his friends. Tolkien writes, Bag End seemed gloomy and disheveled. Frodo wandered round the familiar rooms and saw the light of the sunset fade on the walls and shadows creep out of the corners. It grew slowly dark indoors. I also think this language here reflects the growing danger of staying in Bag End, which was once a safe haven for him. It's once a peaceful and serene home. And now the fact that he's kind of like walking around saying goodbye, the lights fading, shadows creeping out of corners. I think it's showing the danger that's creeping in here for Frodo. And it also reminds you of moving on from a place, from a home in your life when something no longer serves you and it doesn't necessarily feel the same. It feels a little sad. It feels a little empty. So it's now nightfall, the day after the farewell party. Frodo really can't wait any longer. He really has to leave. And as they are all packed up and ready to start walking, Frodo hears voices coming from down the hill, and it's the old gaffer, which is Sam's dad, or the gardener for Bag End. He hears the gaffer speaking with what he says is an unpleasant voice. The gaffer sounds shrill in response. We don't know who he's talking to at one point, but Frodo assumes that it's just another nosy hobbit, right? And he kind of thinks to himself, like, oh, I'm so annoyed. I'm so sick of people asking me about what I'm doing. And he's like, I'm ready to go. And I think this shows Frodo's ignorance of the real danger at the moment, at this stage in the story. And I think if you're a first-time reader, right, or you're just kind of starting the story, it's also us as the reader, we're ignorant. We don't know that this person that's talking to the old gaffer could potentially be deadly. We haven't really been exposed to that yet. We've only heard about it. And so why would Frodo assume that this person asking the old gaffer questions is somebody that's really, truly dangerous. He doesn't even suspect this could be a dangerous outsider. Like, he just assumes it's a nosy hobbit. So he really doesn't know how much danger he's truly in at this point. The fact that Gandalf is not there should be probably more concerning than it is to Frodo. But like I said, I think that his perception of Gandalf, it's almost like when you're a kid and you look at adults and you're like, oh, they're superheroes, they're untouchable, they'd never get hurt or get in trouble. Like, I think that's how Frodo views Gandalf, and he doesn't even consider the possibility that Gandalf's like in trouble. So after he overhears the voices coming from down the hill, he decides it's time to leave. And Sam comes out. He yells to Sam, who's still like in Bag End, and Sam comes out wiping his mouth after chugging the last of the beer in the cellar, which I thought was really funny. Let me try and find that part. Coming, sir, came the answer from far within, followed soon by Sam himself, wiping his mouth. He had been saying farewell to the beer barrel in the cellar. So yeah, that's just another great example of Tolkien's little humor that he adds into the text, right after we're a little anxious about kind of who's, asking questions. Frodo thinks to himself, what an inquisitive lot they all are. He had half a mind to go and ask the gaffer who the inquirer was, but he thought better or worse of it and turned and walked quickly back to Bag End. So even that small decision for Frodo not to go to the gaffer and ask who was talking to him could have changed the course of the whole mission and could have been the end of Frodo if he went down there and tried to see who the gaffer was talking to. So this is a big point now. Frodo finally leaves Bag End, and I feel like we've been saying goodbye, we've been saying farewell, we've had our farewell party, Frodo had his moment kind of in the house, but this is the real beginning of the journey, similar and parallel to what Bilbo went on when he went on his adventure years prior. Little does he know, but he was literally following in the same steps as Bilbo. Goodbye, said Frodo, looking at the dark blank windows. He waved his hand and then turned and, following Bilbo if he had known it, hurried after Peregrine down the garden path. They jumped over the low place in the hedge at the bottom and took to the fields, passing into the darkness like a rustle in the grasses. So that really begins our journey. Really just not insignificant moment, but it's I don't know, when you start any journey, it really just starts with like walking out your front door and taking a couple steps. And I think that's a lot of what this story is about and what Tolkien's writings are about, specific to these hobbits. You don't know where you're going to go. It's a little bit exciting, despite the fact that there is danger, despite the fact that they are in danger. This chapter in the beginning of the journey, like I said before, it's very lighthearted. It's very clear that the hobbits don't really understand like the urgency of them getting the F out of there like as quickly as possible. They don't comprehend that at this point because Gandalf hasn't been able to tell them how dangerous it really is and how important it is that they get a move on and get out of the Shire as quickly as possible. At the beginning of their journey, the first discussion when they get started is just how heavy the packs are. I think this gives us, we start to understand a little bit about the dynamic between the hobbits, a little bit more about what their characters are like. Frodo says that he thinks he has the heaviest stuff in his pack because it's very heavy. I could take a lot more yet, sir. My packet is quite light, said Sam, stoutly and untruthfully. So what we're seeing here already is Sam offering to take away some of Frodo's burdens, right? Even though Sam is carrying just as heavy, if not more of a burden, Maybe we're foreshadowing a little bit here. Pippin replies in typical Pippin fashion, saying, "No, Sam, it's good for him. He's got nothing except what he ordered us to pack. He's been slack lately, and he'll feel the weight less when he's walked off some of his own." So making a little joke about Frodo's weight, saying, you better walk it off. That's why you're feeling the weight here. So a little comedic relief, but also a window into who these characters are. I think, like I said, Sam offering to take that burden from Frodo, offering to carry whatever is in Frodo's pack, Frodo complaining that his pack is too heavy. I mean, that does kind of symbolize and foreshadow a lot of what we're going to see later in the story. Frodo bearing the weight of his burden, Sam doing everything he can to make it easier to Frodo, even if it is already weighing on him, right? Tolkien writes that the hobbits make no noise that either hobbits or wild creatures could hear because they were trying to be quiet, and hobbits are already stealthy. This stealth that hobbits have, I think when I first read the books, I didn't really, or maybe even when you're like watching the movies, I don't think you really understand it. There are some points in the movies where the hobbits are running around and you're like, how do they not see them? Or they're hiding or something. But hobbits, if they're trying to be quiet, they literally can sneak it around and not be seen at all. As they walk away from Hobbiton, Frodo wonders if he'll ever see the valley again. Tolkien is very detailed as they're walking, the way that he describes the path that they're on. It's easier if you have a visual marker. I found some content online that has really more detailed maps of exactly where the hobbits are walking, and I think that's helpful to follow along when you're reading. It's difficult to just describe, right? But they're not going, through the village. They decide that they're going to actually go kind of like across borders of the farms in the Shire to get out because of what Frodo overheard the stranger talking to the old gaffer. So they walk for about 3 hours, and then they decide to rest, eat a frugal supper for hobbits, because hobbits like to eat, and then continue walking until they're in the woods before Pippin says he is sleepy and wants to stop. So what we see a lot in this chapter too is Pippin repeatedly being like, "Oh, can we just stop? I'm tired." Pippin doesn't know what's going on and doesn't know the true nature of their mission. He just wants to chill out and take his time. He doesn't see the rush. But even Frodo and Sam, who understand what's going on, they're also in no hurry. And I think they perceive the Shire as being this untouchable safe haven that they can't even imagine that there is some danger there for them. Frodo says there's no hurry, that they have nearly 2 days more. At this point, their journey is at leisure. They even set up a fire before going to sleep. They set no watch. Even Frodo feared no danger yet, for they were still in the heart of the Shire. So, yeah, they just don't really think that there's any rush here. And at this point, we get a really interesting passage that's talked about a lot. It's literally a tiny paragraph, but basically as they're sleeping, it says, "A few creatures came and looked at them when the fire had died away. A fox passing through the wood on business of his own stopped several minutes and sniffed. Hobbits, he thought. Well, what next? I have heard of strange doings in this land, but I have seldom heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors under a tree. 3 of them. There's something mighty queer about this." He was right, but he never found out any more about it. So this fox that's going and looking at the hobbits while they're sleeping, it's a really great way to understand Tolkien, I think, because Tolkien has a tendency to dive into all aspects of his world and of his universe. And just like how you can go and read about the histories of all different types of elves and characters in Middle-earth and ages of Middle-earth, the fox itself is a character of Middle-earth, and we're able to very quickly see through the lens of the fox just how strange it is that the hobbits are outside sleeping on a tree. It gives the world a little more mystery. I think the first time I read it, I thought that it had more of a purpose than it actually did. I kind of assumed that the fox was, part of like things that were like looking at them or trying to keep an eye on them. But the fox here, I really think it's just showing us that Middle-earth is a whole universe where the nature and the creatures and the animals are also characters in the story. It makes it feel that much more kind of mystical, magical. Foxes symbolize deceit. They symbolize trickery. Maybe here it's meant to symbolize the trickery of them feeling safe in the Shire, how they shouldn't really be feeling safe and so comfortable to light a fire and travel at leisure. Maybe it could symbolize something else, but definitely let me know your thoughts on what you think the fox symbolizes here. So the next morning, the hobbits wake up. Frodo is uncomfortable and notes that he misses his feather bed. Pippin orders Sam to get breakfast ready and get bathwater hot. I also think that when you read the book, Sam is really treated more like a lesser hobbit, almost like a servant. Just the way they talk to him in the books, they kind of boss him around, and Sam's always very eager to help and to do what they ask, whether it's Frodo or anybody else asking him to do things. They definitely still care for Sam, but I wonder if that's kind of the class dynamic between Sam being more of the working class hobbit. It's like he's their servant on this journey, and I don't love that he's treated like that because Sam is a great character. But he is always very eager to help and just wants to make sure that they're comfortable. We get more in this chapter of Tolkien's masterful language and how he describes landscapes and nature. It's just so beautiful. And my favorite quote from this chapter that I highlighted about their journey, it's just a descriptive couple sentences about where they were walking. It says, "Away eastward, the sun was rising red out of the mists that lay thick on the world. Touched with gold and red, the autumn trees seemed to be sailing rootless in a shadowy sea." I just think that's so beautiful. I don't know how you write like that. Trees sailing rootless in a shadowy sea, and it's just really moving to me. A lot of people who are reading the books sometimes complain about the descriptive nature of Tolkien and how much you're reading just about what the landscapes look like or exactly where they're going, but I think it just adds to how real it feels and how moving the text is overall. So another point I wanted to make was, again, they're just lagging a little bit, and it's a little bit frustrating to read when you know how much danger they're really in. They don't even get on the road again until 10 a.m. They make a breakfast. They're complaining about how they're tired. Pippin wants to rest again, but it doesn't seem like Frodo and Sam are in that much of a rush either. They stop a lot for meals on this first part of their journey. They are kind of zigzagging along their road. They are walking, looking across the woody end towards the Brandywine River. And Pippin says, "The road goes on forever, but I can't without a rest. It's high time for lunch." He sat down on the bank at the side of the road and looked away east in the haze, beyond which lay the river and the end of the Shire in which he had spent all of his life. Frodo is silent, and Sam's kind of asking if elves live there. After some silence, Frodo kind of says to himself the little poem that is pretty well recognized, I think, from these books. We start to get in this chapter too a lot of Tolkien's songwriting and poetry that he puts in. Frodo says to himself slowly, "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow, if I can, pursuing it with wary feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say." Pippin remarks that it sounds kind of like one of Bilbo's songs, and Frodo actually says he doesn't know whether he just made it up or if Bilbo sang it. We learn also throughout the story that Bilbo is talented at kind of coming up with little songs and rhymes, and I think Frodo is as well. Hobbits in general, they come up with a lot of songs, like walking songs that we hear about another one later. If you know some of the history of Middle-earth, it was created through song. And I wonder if that speaks a little bit to the hobbits ancient kind of mysterious nature and whether they're connected to earlier beings than some may expect. I think it's a little nod to the creation of Middle Earth, the fact that hobbits are so great at coming up with little songs, little rhymes, stuff like that. Pippin, after hearing the poem, says it does not sound encouraging. Pippin's honestly so funny. Just in this chapter, there have been so many funny moments that with Pippin's character that just come through. Like, his personality is really big and it's just hilarious. It's just relatable. He just wants to rest every like hour. He needs to like sit down. So the hobbits have not seen anyone on the road at this point. They've been journeying alone. They haven't run into anyone. And all of a sudden, Sam actually is the first one to hear it. He stops because he hears somebody approaching. It's interesting that Sam actually hears the rider approaching first, despite the fact that Frodo is the one that's bearing the ring. You would think that he would be more attuned to like a black rider approaching, but instead Sam actually hears it first. Frodo tells them all to hide and just kind of says, I'm sick of people being nosy and paying too much attention to him. Let's just hide just in case. They're not really assuming it's anything too dangerous, right? Despite this kind of urge that Frodo has to hide. They actually joke that if it is Gandalf, they can pop out and surprise him. Frodo hesitated and had this kind of curious feeling and struggling with his desire to hide. So I wonder if that's partially the ring kind of making him want to step out and be found. The hobbits, who are incredibly great at hiding, so they're able to hide from view. They are not found by the horse and the man, but they stop right in front of Frodo. It describes a large man in a black cloak crouched in the saddle. It's very unnerving, very creepy. They turn from side to side, sniffing and listening. This is definitely scary to picture this giant black horse with a man on top in a cloak crouched in the saddle. I feel like that's a little bit different from what the movies show. They do have the hoods on, but they're not necessarily bent over. I think that makes it a little creepier. Frodo has a sudden urge to put the ring on, thinking it may make him safe, but in this moment he remembers Gandalf's warning, but thinks to himself how absurd Gandalf's warning is, which is so strange that he would have this sudden urge to put on the ring, remember what Gandalf said, who he trusts, who he respects, who he's listened to. He hasn't put the ring on in these years that he's had it, in this time that he's known about its true nature, but he thinks his advice absurd. So that shows the hold that the ring is already taken on Frodo. Frodo's hand kind of involuntarily reaches for the ring, and then finally the rider departs. After he leaves, the hobbits just kind of assume that he's one of the big folk, like a human. And then in that moment, Sam realizes that the stranger who was having the conversation with his father, with the old gaffer, this was the person who was asking for Frodo. Frodo is literally steps away from this black rider before he leaves Bag End. Now, what we're really learning here, and the hobbits may not assume this yet, is that the plan to leave when Frodo left, he really should have left earlier. And if Gandalf was able to send word or go back to Hobbiton, he would have told Frodo to get the fuck out of there really fast. And the fact that one of the Black Riders, who was steps away from Bag End, already there asking for Frodo before he even left, shows us that their mission and their initial quest, which at first, this journey to Rivendell was supposed to be pretty easy, supposed to be not filled with too much danger, it's becoming clear that no, this is actually really dangerous, and their plan is, I don't want to say falling apart, because these things kind of happen for a reason, but it's not going the way that they wished it would, or I think that Gandalf would have intended, especially considering Gandalf is not accompanying them. And to think of these little hobbits who, despite Frodo and Sam kind of knowing about the ring and knowing about the dangers, they are so ignorant, and they really are not treating their initial journey, because they think they're safe in the Shire, with any amount of urgency or seriousness. So once Sam realizes that this rider came from Hobbiton and had spoke with his father before he had left, he kind of recounts what the conversation was between the old gaffer and the Black Rider. And I think this is so great, because I mean, these Black Riders are no joke. Like, they are really horrifying, scary creatures. And yet this little hobbit, Sam's dad, basically tells this rider when he comes up looking for Frodo, saying, you know, where's Frodo, where's Baggins, whatever. He is like, he's gone away, he's not here, and stop asking about it, basically. So it shows us how resilient hobbits can be, how courageous they can be in the face of something so scary and so horrifying as one of these Black Riders. Sam's dad is actually really brave. It does say he was a little shrill talking to it, but he's a little hobbit. And maybe it's ignorance, maybe it's, you know, them being sheltered and not understanding how dangerous this thing really is. But he stands up to it and he says, yeah, he's not here anymore. So if it hadn't been for Sam's dad telling the Black Rider that Frodo's gone, this would be the end of the story. Frodo would have gotten overtaken, captured, whatever. The ring would have been taken back. So really, Sam's dad is a big reason why they are able to even leave Bag End, leave the Shire. And his bravery is a huge part of the reason why the beginning of their journey has been successful up to this point. Frodo says that he wishes he knew sooner, and that he would have been more careful if he knew that this person was asking about him. He also says he wishes he waited for Gandalf. Frodo, again, despite him being a little ignorant, despite them all being a little ignorant and not necessarily realizing the danger they're in, he really is so brave for, instead of just waiting around at Bag End for Gandalf to show up, he did what he was supposed to and he left. And if he didn't leave, he would have been screwed. And like I said, the story would be over. So they decide to continue alongside the left of the road. They're not walking like in the road anymore, which is smart. But again, Pippin, of course, needs to take another rest. So they rest inside of a giant tree. And it seems like they're being a little more cautious. They're talking quietly. They're listening for danger, etc. Their spirits lift a little bit, the stars come out, and they start to kind of hum as they're walking along. They sing a song that Bilbo made up about, like a walking song that hobbits have. And I think it's sweet that hobbits they'll sing if they're close to home or sing if they're walking. Again, I think this is a nod to the history of Middle-earth, to how Middle-earth was created through song, and Hobbit's connection to that. As they finish the song, they realize they hear hooves again. So another Black Rider, or perhaps the same one, is approaching. They quickly get out of the way, but just barely in time. Frodo is the only one kind of able to see the shadow approaching. I just think the way that Tolkien writes about these Black Riders is so scary. It almost reads like horror again, and that's why these first couple chapters are so great. We do get more lightheartedness than we will later in the series, but contrasting what they think as their safety of being in the Shire with all of a sudden this danger that's right in front of them. Like, they don't realize it, but they are being followed. They are in horrible danger right now, and even though they are being a little more cautious, they're still not being as cautious as they should be. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass across the lighter space between the two trees and then halt. It looked like the black shade of a horse led by a smaller black shadow. This part, oh my god, so scary. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the path, and it swayed from side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground and then began to crawl towards him. Like, for Frodo, being a little hobbit, spending his whole life in the Shire, he's never seen anything like that. I mean, he's heard stories from Bilbo, but this is beyond anything that they've experienced. He has this desire again to slip on the ring, which shows us that it wants to be found by the rider. It's the ring's hold over Frodo starting to exercise itself, and it's stronger this time than it was before. And thank goodness, but as soon as Frodo really considers putting on the ring, they hear a company of elves singing and approaching. And of course, Sam immediately gets excited about the elves. And it says he would have burst out of the trees and dashed off towards the voices if they had not pulled him back. So the rider, after crawling and sniffing and doing whatever gross stuff it was doing on the ground, once it hears the elves, it leaves. They kind of remain hidden though at this point and just kind of watch the elves coming nearer, the singing's coming nearer, and it's the singing and the sounds of the elves, again, I think because Middle Earth was created through song, and that is so important to the fabric of the universe. The way that it's described is it's more than just kind of like listening to someone singing a song. Like, even for the hobbits who don't understand, Tolkien writes, yet the sound blending with the melody seemed to shape itself in their thought into words which they only partly understood. And then we get a little translation of the song as Frodo hears it. Frodo realizes that these are high elves, saying that not many now remain in Middle Earth. Before long, the elves approach. They could see the starlight glimmering in their hair and in their eyes. There were no lights yet as they walked, a shimmer like the light of the moon above the rim of the hill before it rises seemed to fall about their feet. They were now silent, and as the last elf passed, he turned and looked toward the hobbits and laughed. You can't really even, I guess, recreate what they're describing as the elves looking like in a movie or any sort of adaptation, but the description with words is just so beautiful that they have this moonlight, this starlight that kind of comes off of them, and it sounds just so captivating and so beautiful. And then I think it's funny that it's not until the last elf passes that they actually see the hobbits hiding. And the last elf turns, looks at the hobbits, and laughs. Because to the elves, these like immortal beings, hobbits are like little kids. And they find them kind of silly. And they're just cute and funny to the elves. I also think that the fact that they didn't notice the hobbits, considering that elves are remarkably stealthy as well, they have incredible eyesight. It goes to show, again, how well these hobbits are at hiding, since they didn't notice them until the last elf had passed. They recognize Frodo, and they actually say, "Hail, Frodo." They ask why these three hobbits are out in the woods at night. To them, it's very strange, and it's not something that they would expect to see. Frodo just says, "Oh, I like walking under the stars, but we would welcome your company." The elves laugh at him. They say they have no need of other company, and that hobbits are so dull. So again, they're very dismissive of these hobbits. They're like little kids to them. They don't need to, hang out with hobbits. It's not something they really want to do. Frodo asks how they know his name, and they say that they know Frodo because they have seen him with Bilbo, and they've seen Bilbo a couple of times. Then the leader of the elves introduces himself, or this company of elves introduces himself as Gildor, and explains that they are exiles returning over the Great Sea of the House of Finrod. They came from Valinor originally to get revenge from Melkor for taking the Silmarils, and they, over the ages, have been kind of slowly returning over the Great Sea to the west. And there's not a ton on Gildor that I was able to find, Basically, we know that he is one of the Noldor of the House of Finrod, and is one of the few of these types of elves that are actually left in Middle Earth during the Third Age. But the fact that he is a Noldoran elf of the House of Finrod, and that Frodo is first encountering this type of elf, this old high elf from a group of elves that were originally going to Middle Earth to seek vengeance upon Melkor, who was the original Dark Lord before Sauron, I think holds some significance. And I don't know if Tolkien did that intentionally, or perhaps when he was first writing the story, it was just kind of pulled, but I think there is some significance here that this specific company and line of elves are the first to encounter Frodo on his mission, and they are the first to protect him from some of the evils that are chasing him. So they ask again what Frodo's doing. Pippin actually interrupts and is like, who is this Black Rider? The elves are immediately concerned. They converse and they decide they must actually take the hobbits along with them. So that goes to show you how serious the situation is. They're like, no, we're not hanging out with you guys, you silly little hobbits. Now that they understand what's going on, they're like, okay, you gotta come with us. Frodo bows, he thanks them in Elvish, and Gildor laughs, saying to the other elves to be careful and speak no secrets, and that Bilbo was a good master and Frodo is a scholar of the ancient tongue. I just think that's really cool. He is able to thank them in Elvish and that they actually appreciate it. The high elf at this point, Gildor, he actually bows to Frodo and he calls him elf friend. They march to the hills above Woodhall. They arrive at a spot, kind of grassy spot in the middle of the woods. It sounds really magical. And the elves kind of take counsel, but they don't really take notice of the hobbits anymore at this point. They all feast, tell the hobbits to be merry with them, hang out with them. And the perspectives of Pippin and Sam are described almost as though they're recounting it later. Considering the lens through which we're reading this and how this story and these words have come to us in the universe, essentially you have to remember that Frodo kind of compiles this telling and this story after all of the events happen in the 3 books. And I think this part of the chapter, we get a little glimpse into the historical nature of the text, right? It talks about Pippin recalling afterwards what he had experienced instead of speaking more like in the middle of the narrative. For example, Pippin afterwards recalled little of either food or drink, for his mind was filled with the light upon the elf faces and the sound of voices so various and so beautiful that he felt in a waking dream. But he remembered that there was bread, surpassing the savor of fair white loaf to one who is starving. So that's what he recalls from the night. And then the next paragraph, it says, Sam could never describe in words nor picture clearly to himself what he felt or thought that night, though it remained in his memory as one of the chief events of his life. The nearest he ever got was to say, well, sir, if I could grow apples like that, I would call myself a gardener, but it was the singing that went to my heart, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, I think that's really cool that at certain points in the narrative, we switch from kind of being in the middle of things and being in Frodo's head and what's going on to talking a little bit more like we're in the future and we're reading this text as a history of Middle Earth, and these are real people who recounted these events after they happened, right? Eventually, Pippin falls asleep, and Sam does as well, but he refuses to leave Frodo's side and kind of curls up at his feet. The way Sam is described in the text, again, it's a little different than the movie. I mean, Sam is so loyal to Frodo in the movies, but he's way more like, I mean, even one of the chapters I think wrote that he's like a dog with Frodo, kind of waiting for him to tell him what to do. He's just the definition of loyal. I mean, he's the epitome of a loyal companion and exactly what Frodo needs to accomplish this mission, and arguably is more crucial to the mission than Frodo maybe. So after Sam and Pippin drift off to sleep, Frodo stays up late talking to the leader Gildor. They talk a little bit about the world outside, and at last Frodo kind of asks Gildor, have you seen Bilbo since he left? And he says he's actually seen him twice, but other than that says no more. And I think, again, we're rooted, or Frodo right now is really rooted in how much he cares about Bilbo, and that's really what's pushing him forward. The elf is asking him, where are you going? What are you doing? And Frodo's confused because he's like, how do you know that the enemy is pursuing me? And the elf is basically like, Gildor's like, well, you have these black riders following you. Like, obviously the enemy's pursuing you. I don't know why, but it's pretty scary, and you need to understand that danger is all around you. Frodo is confused because he says, well, we're in the Shire. What do you mean? And the elf's response is, it is not your own Shire. Others were here before hobbits, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you fencing yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out. Frodo's kind of pressing Gildor to tell him more of the Black Riders, to tell him more of what's going on. Gildor is like, why don't you ask Gandalf? Frodo explains that Gandalf is missing, and this is troubling to Gildor because I think Gildor understands, okay, these hobbits are entirely alone. These horrible Black Riders are pursuing them. Why isn't Gandalf here if he's advised them to do this? That seems out of place, right? So, and the elf understands that Gandalf can get into trouble, that something could be going on, something bad could be going on, and he is clearly concerned about this. Frodo explains that Gandalf has not been seen. He says, should I wait for him? Gildor was silent for a moment. I do not like this news. That Gandalf should be late does not bode well, but it is said, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours to go or wait. So Frodo's really asking him, like, should I wait for Gandalf or should I go? And Gildor doesn't give him an answer. He says, you have to decide. You decide to go or wait. So Frodo, in response, this is pretty funny, actually says, go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes. And in response, Gildor says, elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But what would you? You have not told me all concerning yourself, and how then should I choose better than you? But if you demand advice, I will for friendship's sake give it. I think you should now go at once without delay. So that's a really cool quote there, that elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. And I think that maybe speaks a little bit to Frodo's agency in this chapter, where Gandalf leaves. Gandalf has trusted Frodo to make decisions for his own sake. What Gildor's really saying here is, even if you're a wise person talking to a wise person, your advice may not lend itself any good and may not change things, or any course could go bad. To say that advice is a dangerous gift is in and of itself wise. We see throughout the stories and throughout this trilogy a lot of second guessing, a lot of asking for advice, and not a lot of answers until the decisions have been made and the courses have been set. So I think that says a lot about fate. I think that says a lot about wisdom. I think it's a really interesting quote that we have there. Frodo presses the elf again to tell him what the Black Riders are, because Gandalf never explained to him exactly who they are. And Gildor is basically like, what else do you need to know? Go. Like, they're servants of the enemy. They are not here to help you. They are here to hurt you. You need to leave. I think at this point, Gildor's kind of done with their conversation, because then Frodo asks, well, where shall I find courage? And the only thing Gildor says is, courage is found in unlikely places. Be of good hope. Sleep now. In the morning we shall have gone, but we will send our messages through the lands. So, yeah, he's done. He doesn't want to talk to Frodo anymore. Frodo kind of mysteriously, like, immediately drifts off to sleep. But before that, Gildor does say, I name you elf friend. May the stars shine upon the end of your road. Seldom have we had such delight in strangers, and it is fair to hear words of the ancient speech from the lips of other wanderers in the world. So that concludes our chapter 3, with Frodo kind of drifting off to sleep after his conversation with Gildor. It is becoming clear that not everything is going according to plan. So hopefully the hobbits will have better luck in chapter 4. Thank you guys so much for listening. I am so excited to be getting into chapter 4, A Shortcut to Mushrooms. We are really starting our journey now, getting into more dangerous and more exciting things as we move through the chapters. If you guys haven't, follow me on TikTok at Lady of the Pod, also on Instagram. This is Lady of the Rings. Go pour yourself some tea, maybe make some second breakfast, and we'll talk again soon.